Thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage. In this video, we're going to install the crankshaft, the rear cap for the main seal, and the bushing for the distributor intermediate shaft. Now when you're installing this, there is a special tool for installing this bushing. And if you don't have one, if you don't want to rent one, and if you do have a camshaft or a camshaft bearing installation tool, you can use that, because the bushing that we're going to install actually fits right on the end of the tool for the camshaft bearing installation tool, luckily, and you can use the cone, the centering cone, to center it in the distributor hole when you drive in the bushing. Put a light coat of grease on the inside of the hole for the bushing and on the outside of the bushing itself, and then tap it in. Now I can show you why I had to take the block back to the machine shop when I was having a thrust bearing issue when I was checking for the clearance on the main bearings. First, we install the crank by cleaning off the block on each main, wiping off the bearings, and then putting them all in place. And put on a light coat of assembly lube. Now before installing the crank, you have to put in the rear main seal, and I'm going to coat the back of it in the groove with this Reinzosil. This will replace many of the sealants or gasket makers that you use when you put an engine together. A light coating of this in the groove. Put the seal in to make sure lip is facing forward. I always leave it off a little bit so that the gaps are not lined up with the cap, and then put on a light coating of assembly lube. Now we can gently sit the crankshaft into place. What was happening was, after I installed the thrust cap, the thrust bearing on the crank, my thrust went from 8 thousandths, it went to 0. It went to 0. And that's what happens when you switch from bolts to studs. Sometimes the studs are slightly different. So the machine shop had to very slightly mill this hole on the cap and mill it slightly out around so that this cap can be back in position so I get my thrust. So now I can install my caps and check thrust again. With the caps installed, now we can put on all the hardware. If you're using studs, make sure the studs are fully seated before you run down your hardware. Then tighten it down. These go to 90 foot-pounds, so I'm going to do it in 3 increments, 30, 60, and 90. Now I can put on the rear seal cap, and again I'm using the Reinzosil. I have used that. There's a little bit on the face here just to seal the face, underneath the rear seal, underneath the side seals here. So I'm using that to hold those in place, and this is offset the same way it's offset inside the block. I have to admit, it does take a few tries to get these flush. Few tries, but if you take your time and preset those, you'll get it flush. These get torqued to 30 foot-pounds. We're all torqued down, rear seals in place, Check to make sure the crankshaft rotates nice and free and it's nice and smooth. One tip for you when you're doing this, make sure you don't get your fingers between the counterweights or the pin and the block, because if you get it pinched in there, you'll get a nasty cut because the block is sharp and the crank is sharp, and once it's rotating, that mass will pinch your finger pretty good. I know because I've done it. Last check, make sure we have the right thrust. Okay, we are all the way to the rear. We'll check our thrust forward. And I guess we got 6. Make sure it's zeroed. Got to do zeroing out, it's important. And settles right around just over 5. Let's call it 5.5. Perfect. 4 would be perfect, but we'll take 5.5. Just a real quick word about assembly lubes. I don't have a real preference. I've used all different kinds of assembly lubes over the years, whether it's a ComCams, assembly lube, all kinds of different assembly lubes, Molly lubes. Right now, I just prefer to use a lube, assembly lube that has PTFE in it. So any brand you buy, as long as it says PTFE assembly lubricant, that's going to work fine. The crankshaft is installed, it rotates nice and free, we got our seal in place, the thrust is perfect, and don't forget when you're lubricating your bearings and putting them together, rotate the thrust surface on the bearings so those are lubricated as well. You don't want it dry when you start it up. If that crankshaft thrusts in one direction, you don't want it hitting a dry surface. And as always, don't forget to put a cover on your engine before you say goodnight. Thanks for stopping by Pete's Garage.